All right, let's get into a little overview of the course. Dun, dun. All right, let me hide myself here. Bloop. Okay, so the course is a overall survey of genetics, including some stuff you've seen before, and a lot more depth of things you've seen before, and hopefully some new material, and as always, exciting material. So this is my contact information. This semester, for the foreseeable future, I won't be really taking students for visits to my office, but I will have office hours or student hours over WebEx. You're welcome to participate in those. You're welcome to make an appointment to meet with me. We can meet in the classroom after class. We could meet by WebEx electronically. I'm happy to meet with you really anytime we can make it work for ourselves to help you with any questions you have. So before we get too far into the course, today we'll just kind of go over the overall themes of the class and talk about context. So when we get to genetics, right, you've probably had genetics before. What does it mean? Well, the root of genetics, you might recognize a word in there, gene. Gene is a more familiar term these days than it used to be. People are studying genes and looking for genes. I think they show up a little bit more in common conversation. A gene, however, gene is really based on genetics, and genetics, that word is more related to something like genesis. So genesis is when something comes into being. Where did it come from? Generate, generation, these are words that are related to the origin of genetics. And genetics refers to this question of how something came to be the way it is. So for me, this is a very fundamental question for an organism or species or just life overall. How did it get to be that way? So if you're interested in any number of things from disease to ecology, you have organisms to work with, and those organisms have their genetic programming, as we'll see. So it's a very fundamental concept to all of biology. That's why it's a required course for biology majors. And this is really one of the main reasons that I like genetics. I also like it as it's very, kind of makes a lot of sense in biology. It's very like quantitative and almost mathematical. And I dare say I kind of like the mathematical overlap with biology. So shown here, these are different breeds of dogs. And you probably know that dogs are descended from ancestors that were not dogs, and they were bred by people intentionally or unintentionally selecting for traits that people found useful. So whether that was a tough personality to fight off wolves, or I don't know, defend the camp, or a fluffy personality to be a better companion, different colors, shapes, abilities of smell and hearing and behavior that has to do with hunting or herding, things like that. We've all, our species, human species over thousands of years, crafted these dog breeds to be what they are today. So a lot of diversity we see here in living dog breeds today, but they really trace back to ancestral wolves, and wolves across the world are all pretty similar to each other. So this is kind of a little nod to what genetics can show you. All this variation was sort of present under the surface of wolves and was able to be brought out through breeding. So you can look at differences, all kinds of differences across life, and ask this question, kind of where it came from. And that's where genetics comes in. I mentioned genetics is a big topic in popular media, so you might see news stories like this one, where somebody or a group of researchers are looking for a genetic answer, right? So if you have a phenomenon and you're wondering, why is that? You can use genetics as a potential tool to answer that. So there are people in the world who are gay, who are different, kind of across the spectrum of what we call gender. And so some people are interested to know, okay, why is that? Very interesting diversity in the human species and the human population. Why is there some kind of programming that we could look to biologically to find out whether someone is going to be gay or a reason why they are gay? This is a topic that has received some attention. And in this case, a lot of researchers have looked for, say, some genetic signature, and there's not really a clear genetic answer to this. So obviously reasons for existing in various ways, they can't all be traced back to genetics, and that's good, right? We have different reasons to be like we are. Some of that is genetic. That falls more if you listen to like nurture and nature. Genetics is a little bit more in the nature department, things that are programmed into you, and in many ways we can't change our genetics. Versus nurture, there are some features about ourselves that change based on the environment that we grow up in. So still not a clear answer for why homosexuality exists. I don't know. I think it's kind of more interesting to have some things like this that are not just black and white, for example. But anyway, you can look for answers for questions like this. And a lot of times we see studies showing up. They make a splash when people release their study findings. A little bit more about what we can learn studying genetics. Basically, as I mentioned with the dog example, we can look at natural variation and find out, okay, is there a reason why that variation exists? It's a lot of times boiled down to a single difference. So we've got, in the left-hand example here, these are birds called flickers. And in North America, we have red-shafted and yellow-shafted flickers. There's an obvious color difference overall in the birds, as well as some minor differences pointed out by those numbers on the diagram. And by applying genetic tools, you can see what's maybe causing those differences. What are the genes that are different that go along with the phenotypes or the appearance that's different? And you can map those and say maybe you find an interesting result that tells you where red comes from in these birds or where the yellow comes from. You can learn more about that. In the middle, this is a group of flowers showing a single gene that can be mutated to take a flower that is normally bilaterally symmetrical, so sort of up and down, sideways presentation as shown on these flowers on the left. Take that and switch it over to a radial symmetry, which is more of a dinner plate kind of presentation, uniform shape all around, a little more flat landing platform. A single gene makes this change, and this is a pretty drastic and significant difference if you are a pollinator. So an animal looking to visit these flowers and gather nectar might be signaled to approach this flower in a way that it's differently signaled to approach this flower. And then, of course, that has applications for evolving different kinds of flowers, responding to different kinds of pollinators, and so on. So the genetics in this case is giving us a single gene that we can look at as evidence for this, or a cause really for this shift from one kind of flower to another. Moving over to a human example, lactose intolerance is known to be caused by genetic differences in the human population. And if we look across humans, this map shows just broad regions of the world and roughly the proportion of people in those regions that are lactose intolerant. So it turns out most people in the world have trouble as adults drinking milk. We are mammals, and as mammals, we drink milk from our mothers as babies. And then at some point, most mammals are weaned off of milk and they have no need or desire to drink milk in their adult life. Humans, because of our cultivating cows and other animals that we get milk from to drink, not really the most natural thing, but certainly beneficial to humans. Because of that, cultures that have a history of milk consumption, cheese consumption, they have in their past sort of lost or been selected out of that ancestral lactose intolerance into an ability to drink milk as adults and digest the sugars in milk. So Northern Europe has a low incidence of lactose intolerance. Kind of goes along with, right, where you find cheese in the world, is the cheese makers of the world. Also the source ancestrally of a lot of the people who attend UW-Whitewater, right? So a lot of us, myself included, are descended from people whose ancestry is in Northern Europe. I am lactose tolerant myself, but across the world, this is actually a minority phenotype ability to digest lactose. We can find out why that is. We can use actually the genetic information about lactose intolerance to overcome that, and people can do a rather simple like home therapy for getting over their lactose intolerance should they really want to eat some cheese even though they're lactose intolerant. Before we go too far in the course, I want to discuss one topic here. This is a term that's going to come up a little bit, and I just want to introduce it because it's going to come up, and I think the way that people think about this term is different than the way that it might get used in the class. So I'm going to use this term normal, and normal, you can think of more falling into the definition of average, right? So normal features found in average or majority of individuals. So sometimes we talk about people, sometimes we talk about animals or plants. If we're talking about something that is normal, doesn't really have any judgment about good or bad. We appreciate diversity, and not everyone is going to have the so-called normal features for everything we're looking at. So just maybe when you think about normal in biology, think about the normal distribution, which is shown here, otherwise known as the bell curve. So if you take a measurement of something in a biological organism, a population, you typically get a mean or an average, and then the variation around the mean is shown here, where most individuals have measurements that are pretty close to the mean. So I'll show you an example of human height in a little bit. There's an average height, and then most people are pretty close to the average height. This darkly shaded box means that 68% of people fall within this amount of variation from the average. If we go even farther out, 95% of people fall in this range of variation around the mean. So these are units of standard deviation. We don't really talk about those in this course, but it's good. Maybe you've seen this before, good to be familiar with. And then finally, 99.7% of people fall within this range. And there are still some people who would fall out as really exceptionally tall if this were measurement of height, or really exceptionally short. And they'll still contribute to this normal distribution, but they're in a range that might get called abnormal or something like that. Just kind of helps me to refer to things like the normal individual has 23 pairs of chromosomes. The normal meiosis delivers alleles equally to 2 gametes, and so on. Not always the case, but most of the time, normally. So just an example here of human height. These are individuals who are exceptionally tall and exceptionally short. They've been brought together in the same place to really highlight that difference. Again, showing normal distributions. This is a measurement of a sample of men in blue and a sample of women in this purple-red color. And they have a nice normal distribution, this bell curve distribution of heights as they are measured. And normal, I think maybe some of us are accustomed to feeling normal for all of our features. Just want to highlight that it's not always the case, right? So not everything about you is even the majority of what you would find in humans. So here's some examples. Probably one of the easier ones for us all to match would be numbers of fingers on our hands, right? So 10 fingers, 5 on each hand is the normal number of human fingers, but that's not true for 0.2% of the human population. So 99.8% of us have 5 fingers on each hand, but that's not necessarily true for everyone. If we look at the lactose intolerance example, it turns out that about 65% of people worldwide are actually lactose intolerant. So the majority, I don't know if you really say normal here, maybe getting over towards normal, the normal human condition is actually not to be able to digest lactose as an adult. The normal human eye color, the majority human eye color is brown. So if you take numbers of people across the world, most people have brown eyes. And it's a minority of people who have blue eyes. Maybe a little more esoteric example in the lower left here. This is an herb called cilantro. Some of you might be familiar and enjoy cilantro. Some people, 18% of humans, taste cilantro, and to them it tastes like soap. So that's an extremely distasteful response. So not just like they can't enjoy the flavor, but it's this extreme other flavor because of the way that their taste buds are wired. That is a little bit more of a minority phenotype, but pretty good number of people. 1 in 4 people, or 1 in 5 people worldwide, more or less, have this taste bud phenotype where they taste cilantro as soap. Probably would not enjoy whatever you're feeding them with cilantro. So as I mentioned, genes are frequently studied. People are trying to look for new examples of genes that cause really anything. So if you have a question about why a human or an animal or a plant looks or behaves the way it does, you can look for a genetic answer. This is a case where, in this example here, there was a headline a couple years ago about supposedly finding a genetic signature for cheating. Right? So they took a study of people and they found out that people who were more likely to cheat on their partner had a genetic similarity a little bit above average, so, or beyond, I should say beyond random. So a statistically significant difference in people who are faithful to their partner or cheat on their partner relative to a genetic difference. So I haven't followed up on this one. This is from 5 years ago at this point. I don't know that there's a whole lot extra on this, but it's like this genetic signature for being predisposed to cheat. So if this happens to you, you can say, I'm sorry, I cheated because it was genetic. I was wired to do it. Sorry, honey. See how well that goes out. Let me know. All right, so we're going to talk about a few different aspects of genetics. These are highlighted in your book. Just want to introduce them real quick here. One topic is transmission genetics. So transmission, to transmit from parents to offspring, basically the genes that the parents have and how those get into the offspring. A little more probably what you've already covered in genetics class, Punnett squares, alleles, and so on. For example, how the crested tuft on these ducks here comes about. There's a genetic cause for that. And ducks with crested feathers are more likely to come from parents that have crested feathers. Molecular genetics, we'll cover this in detail as well. This gets down into the molecules that cause the phenotype. So we're going to kind of introduce some genetic concepts with transmission and then look more at the direct causes as to what genes, what molecules cause a particular phenotype. This is an example of a protein, which is highlighted over here. And this protein is responsible for blood clotting. So some people have a mutated version of these proteins that clot blood, and their blood is less likely to clot when they get a wound. So a disease known as hemophilia results when a person gets a cut and they bleed without stopping because they are less able to clot their blood. This can be one of the causes here, being deficient in a coagulation protein. So again, knowing about that as the cause for the phenotype, and then you'd also be able to study the gene that gives you the mutated version of the protein. Kind of seal that all up as a nice clean explanation if that happens to you. And then a little bit at the end of the semester, we'll cover population genetics, looking at genes, how they move through populations and end up in individuals. So a little bit more focus on groups of individuals as opposed to single individuals one at a time. And of course, these all work together. Transmission, molecular, and population genetics are all aspects of the same field of genetics. So the same tools apply across, and there's a lot of overlap between them. And very useful, as I've mentioned before. All right. Let me take a little stop, and then I will get this back.